Before this episode begins, I'd like to say that I will be heading to DinoCon UK on the 25th and 26th of July in Birmingham. So if you see me wandering around in my podcast t-shirt, come and say hello. I have bookmarks and pin badges to give away as well. I'm really looking forward to it, and I'll see you there.
With George Lucas's Star Wars and 78 Everything Changes, that's such an enormous blockbuster success, and the Alien movies and Terminator and The Matrix and Avatar and all these huge visual texts. And that, I think, is the key thing, that science fiction shifts a bit from being primarily a literature of ideas and about written stories to being a literature of the visual spectacular.
Welcome back to The Pirates Don't Eat the Tourists, and I'm your host, Roland Squire. This season, Stones to Stories, we're tracing prehistoric fiction from the Victorian fossil hunters through to the self-published novels of today. To help frame the whole season, I'm joined by someone who has thought more carefully about the history of science fiction than almost anyone else. He's Professor of 19th-century Literature at Royal Holloway, University of London, and prolific author and editor of science fiction stories. He has also written the field's most critical study of the genre in the history of science fiction. Please welcome to the podcast, Adam Roberts. Adam, thank you so much for joining me today. How are you?
I'm very well, Roland. Thank you for inviting me. This is going to be fascinating to talk about this stuff, because it is, I'm a man of mature years, but I'm still basically at heart a kid, still love science fiction, still love dinosaurs. I'm sure you're the same.
Yes, very much so. I sent you the list. Looking at those names on there, what would you take away from the range of authors on that list? I
mean, there's a lot you could say about the kind of trajectory of prehistory and the way it filters through down into culture. So the reason we're starting in the 19th century is because this is the great age of fossil discovery and piecing together the kind of longue durée history of the planet. And I think you're probably right. I think Jules Verne is it's one of the earliest examples of a dinosaur fiction. But then through the 20th century and up to the 21st century, there's a fundamental problem, which is that from quite early on, people came to understand that dinosaurs and human beings had never coexisted on the planet. So if you want to tell a story that is more than just paleontology, you have to put characters in there. And that means you need twist. You need dinosaurs to be resurrected, as in Jurassic Park, or you need people to go back in time, as in the Ray Bradbury story, or you need to find some other way of putting those two things together. And I think what interests me about it is the way what is a much older trope, if I can call it that, of dragons and monsters that goes back into the history of fantasy and medieval romance and so on, gets kind of superseded, I was going to say, but actually dragons are still very popular, aren't they? But there's something similar going on with the fascination that science fiction writers have with dinosaurs, except that it's grounded in reality. These were real, in inverted commas, dragons. No, they're real, not in inverted commas, dragons in inverted commas, but they were actually real. I'm not a dinosaur truther. I think there were actual dinosaurs as things go. So there's several layers to that. To answer your question, first, which takes its cue from Jules Verne. So in the Voyage to the Centre of the Earth, characters explore these subterranean caves and they go deeper and deeper into the earth. And Verne styles that as going further and further back in time until they stumble out into this large subterranean hollow earth world, which is still inhabited by dinosaurs. And there's something of that Edgar Rice Burroughs was interested in, the idea that the earth was hollow and that if you went inside the earth, it would be a kind of primitive version of the earth, a sense in which dinosaurs are there to represent the deep kind of ancient history of the planet. But then I think what you get later on, and I'm interested in why it would be that in the 80s and the 90s there was a sudden kind of resurgence of interest in dinosaur stories. I'm thinking of things like Harry Harrison's West of Eden, which is an alternate evolution narrative where the dinosaurs haven't died out and have evolved into intelligent, kind of civilized, within reason creatures, but also Michael Crichton's Jurassic Park novel, which is 1990, and then, of course, the Spielberg movie, which becomes this enormous hit. Suddenly, dinosaurs are all over everywhere in the 90s, and there have been multiple sequels to Jurassic Park at the end of that century, which are more, I think, about science and about the possibilities of science and resurrecting these creatures so that you can tell monster stories. And I'm not sure what was going on in the 90s that meant that dinosaurs came back in such a big way.
No, I don't know. There was definitely a dinosaur renaissance at the kind of midpoint of the 80s.
Yeah.
I'm interested. I'll dig into that this series to see how the pop culture sort of is the reason for that resurgence in that time. What was going on at that time? It'd be interesting to find out. I was wondering whether you could give us a sort of brief description of what we're talking about of science fiction. What are the key touchstones that make a book science fiction?
So the one standard answer to that would be to say that a science fiction story, this definition kind of also encompasses fantasy, and sometimes people bracket the two together as fantastica as a kind of broad Science fiction stories include elements in the story that aren't in our actual world. There are lots of novels which you could call mimetic fiction or realistic fiction, which are set in versions of our world that are recognizably so. For science fiction or for fantasy, you have to have what the critic Darko Suvin, is a very eminent critic of science fiction, calls a novum. And novum is just a Latin word for new thing. So the novum could be a piece of technology, it could be a time machine or an interstellar spacecraft or an advanced robot, or it could be some conceptual. In Ursula Le Guin's Left Hand of Darkness, the novum is a society where gender is entirely fluid and people can swap between male and female, but it's a way of rethinking our assumptions about the world.
Mm-hmm.
And that, I think, is the heart of it. I mean, there are also the novums in fantasy are more likely to be magic and kind of traditional, looking back into the past, whereas the novums of science fiction often are futuristic and looking to the future, but then we're talking about dinosaurs, and there's nothing more deeply embedded in the past than dinosaurs. So in a book like Jurassic Park, Michael Crichton's novel, the novum is that this new technology which is able to resurrect DNA that's been preserved in amber and splice it and make new dinosaurs out of it. But at the same time, the novum is the fact that we have dinosaurs again. This very ancient form of life comes back. So, I mean, it's a way of thinking about science fiction. There's another way of thinking about science fiction, which is to see less in terms of what happens in the story and more in terms of what place science fiction has in the kind of larger history of culture. So we say, well, when does science fiction begin? Brian Aldiss said the first science fiction novel was Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. So that's 1818. And that science fiction becomes a big deal through the 19th century. We're talking about Jules Verne. We could mention H.G. Wells. And then explodes in the 20th century. And that's, again, probably not coincidental. There may be a reason why dinosaurs came back into fashion in such a big way in the last decades of the 20th century. But I think there certainly is a reason why the 19th and the 20th century saw this explosion of interest in science fiction, because this is when industrial revolution and technological advances changing society very rapidly. Everything is kind of being made new, and that puts you into a forward kind of frame of mind where you're thinking, what's the next change going to be? The Apollo mission, it was an amazing technical achievement, but it also casts our imaginations out into the cosmos, and we can tell ourselves stories about traveling to distant worlds and distant stars. So by that reasoning, the way to think about science fiction, and the reason I mention this is because it really interests me that there are so many dinosaurs in science fiction. We think about science fiction as inherently a modern form of literature and culture.
Yeah.
And what I say, you mentioned my history of science fiction. Thank you for that. And I expect to sell millions more copies off the back of your kind endorsement. One of the arguments I make in that history of science fiction is through the 19th and 20th century, written science fiction, often in the form of short stories, but sometimes in the form of novels, was popular, but not in a fairly small way. It had a kind of dedicated fan base of people who would read these stories and go to science fiction conventions. And that was great. And then with George Lucas's Star Wars, 1978, everything changes. That's such an enormous blockbuster success. And then all the sequels to that movie through the 80s and 90s, and the Alien movies and Terminator and The Matrix and Avatar and all these huge visual texts. And that, I think, is the key thing. The science fiction shifts a bit from being primarily a literature of ideas and about written stories to being a literature of the visual spectacular on the big screen, on television and video games. And in that latter form, it becomes a global culture. So now if you draw up a list of the top 20 highest grossing movies of all time, they're basically all science fiction or fantasy, except for Titanic. Titanic is not science fiction or fantasy, but it is still a movie of the visual spectacular. It's amazing special effects, and it takes you to a place that you can't imagine otherwise being. But the people who traipsed to go and see all the Avatar movies are entering into a new, amazing world full of dragons again, but bright colours and high advanced technology that is thoroughly immersive, but is very visual. So I'd say two things there very quickly. One is that as a writer of verbal text, as a writer of written science fiction, part of me thinks, well, if only a tiny fraction of the people who went to see Avatar bought my novels, I'd be rich beyond the dreams of Croesus. But they don't. And the people do still read science fiction, and obviously we still write science fiction, but that is kind of small scale beside what's happened. And that relates us back to dinosaurs, I think, because one of the things we have to say about dinosaurs is they're just very big.
Just starting Journey to the Centre of the Earth for the first time and just loving it, just loving the adventure of it. And I was wondering whether he was an early entry point to science fiction for you.
I think I worked back to Verne, and I think I started reading as a kid all the golden age and new wave science fiction that was around in paperback form. And then I fell in love with H.G. Wells. And people often link Verne and Wells as if they're the two kind of grandfathers of science fiction. But actually Verne was a generation older than Wells. He was publishing in the 1860s, whereas Wells doesn't get going until the 1890s. But then when I discovered Verne, it's so fascinating, and there's so much of what he does pays through into science fiction.
I really like there's a quote in your book from Thomas D. Clareson, who sums up Verne's novels as being about a man of reason who journeys to some exotic destination and then experiences a series of largely disconnected adventures. And I just think that's such a brilliant quote, and exactly what I it's like a tree. He's so much interested in that adventure and the journey of it rather than, the destination, I suppose.
Yeah, and the kind of collective title for the Verne adventures are the Voyage Extraordinaire, extraordinary voyages. And he himself, when he became famous and rich enough, bought himself a gigantic yacht and used to sail around in it, and that was what he enjoyed doing. And you're right. I mean, one of the things that's interesting about Verne in the science fiction context is how rarely he goes into space. So he does have an adventure where he sends a small crew to the moon. They get fired out of a gigantic cannon in Florida, but they don't land on the moon. They just fly around the back of it and then come back to Earth. And he has a very strange later adventure called Edgar, where a comet smashes into the Earth and breaks off a huge chunk of the Earth that then flies out into space. And improbably, the people living on that chunk of Earth, it's a bit of North Africa, and they survive. They go and hide in caves, and they're all right. And they go on this kind of tour of the solar system. Didn't make an awful lot of sense. But Verne wrote dozens of novels, and almost all of them are voyages under the sea, with Captain Nemo in his famous submarine, or around the world in 80 days, or 5 weeks in a balloon. And it is about just traveling. And I think the appeal of that is partly, again, the late 19th century, at a time when very few people had the opportunity to travel. There were no up-price airlines. There were no package holidays. You would mostly just stay where you were. You were born, live and die in the same small location. And there was something very exotic and exciting about these adventures where you could go all around the world. And I think that's one of the things that makes Voyage to the Centre of the Earth stand out, is that it's not just a voyage through space, although they do descend through these volcanic caves in Iceland, and they go down and they discover this kind of hollow Earth, this giant sea with dinosaur ichthyosaurs sporting in it. It's a journey back in time as well. So it's partly to do with there's a Viking who's supposed to have. I don't want to spoil the story for you.
No, I've read it. I read it really quickly because I was sort of trying to savor it, and then I just ended up just loving it.
It is great, but all the way through they keep seeing the rune of this Viking who's preceded them, even though he was it's 1,000 years earlier, and he somehow found his way down there. And That's one layer of history, and then you get into this subterranean realm, and that's another layer of history. So again, the subterranean world idea is actually quite an ancient one. There's a Danish writer called Ludvig Holberg in the 18th century who wrote about a hollow earth that you can sort of get to. And there was an American called John Sims, Symmes, who posited that the hollow earth is real and said you can get there if you just go up to the North Pole. This is before the North Pole had been reached. If you go to the North Pole, you'll find a big kind of hole there, and you just go through and you're in the hollow earth. And it was widely believed, and people, there were bills passed in Congress to fund an expedition to take us into the hollow earth. The thing that makes it different for Verne is that for most people imagine the hollow earth to be a place where an advanced civilization, a utopian world. Whereas Verne says, no, to go underground is kind of to go back in time and to get further and further away from modernity. And that is really quite striking. But it is, it's also, you're right, it's just really a really well-told adventure. So is this the first Verne that you've read?
Yes. To say that so I listened to a cassette recording of, like, an audiobook of Journey to the Centre of Earth when I was much younger. And it was heavily abridged, and there was this classical music that played every about 5 seconds. Yeah. And I can see why kids love it as well. And that sort of leads me on to the next person on the list, which is Arthur Conan Doyle. Both Verne and Doyle just seem to be from the perspective of, isn't this just a jolly adventure sort of thing, rather than kind of what I think of as science fiction later on.
There's no shortage of jolly adventures in later science fiction, but you're right. It can seem a little single-minded, I think, the way these things work. Conan Doyle is a really interesting writer because he's most often associated with Sherlock Holmes. It's a most famous creation. It had nothing to do with dinosaurs at all. And he became tired of the fact that Holmes was his most famous creation and wrote all sorts of other stuff. He wrote historical novels. He wrote The Lost World, which comes out in 1912, which breaches that problem of how we put dinosaurs and humans together by imagining this hidden valley where dinosaurs have never gone extinct, that humans eventually break into somewhere in South America at a time when, I suppose it was a time when it was still possible to set an adventure that way because the world had not been kind of thoroughly explored. There comes a point in the 20th century when we simply know too much about our home planet to be able to imagine that there are secret nooks and crannies where dinosaurs still live. But it's fun and it's a jolly adventure.
With Arthur Conan Doyle and then the next person, Edgar Rice Burroughs, they're writing in the pulp era of science fiction. So tell me a little bit about the importance of that time for the genre.
So it's the first kind of big expansion of readership, and the readership comes about for two reasons, not to be too dry and social historian about it, but one is that it's at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century that literacy levels start to really take off because education becomes required by law. Everyone has to go to school. Everyone learns to read. So there are lots of people who can read. And the pulp magazines, which had the advantage of being really cheap because they were printed on cheap paper that was made from wood pulp. That's where the name comes from. And they had garish bright covers with coal tar dyes that caught the eye, were pitched at this new readership. So it wasn't sophisticated poetry or philosophy. It was exciting adventures for ordinary people to read. And it was a very successful form of publishing. So there were science fiction pulps, there were noir pulps and crime pulps and Western adventures and romance pulps and all sorts of things. It's really interesting to me that you still get all through the century, you get magazines dedicated to crime stories or to Western adventures. But it is science fiction and fantasy that comes to dominate the pulps through the 1920s and the 1930s. And that I find that very interesting, right into the 40s. And they don't die away until later in the century. And they die away in the 50s in part because cinema becomes a much bigger and more spectacular deal when you get widescreen, full-colour movies. That attracts people. But also because novels start to take off. Cheap paperback novels start being published. People buy those instead of buying the magazines. But you're right. So then writers like Edgar Rice Burroughs, again, he's most famous for Tarzan, and there are several Tarzan stories where Tarzan encounters dinosaurs. What's interesting there is some of them are because Tarzan lives in quote unquote darkest Africa. So it's still a place where to Western sensibilities, it was kind of an unexplored territory. So you could imagine there might be all sorts of monsters and creatures lurking there. But also Edgar Rice Burroughs has a whole set of stories set in a hollow earth. And when you go into the hollow earth, his hollow earth is full of these sorts of wonderful creatures. And then he wrote the Land That Time Forgot, which is a very strange narrative that was made into a film in the 1970s. I remember going to see it in the cinema in the 1970s and being a bit puzzled by it, actually. It's U-boat sailing in space through this land that is also somehow travelling through time, through the kind of narrative of evolution. Have you read that?
Yes, I read that a couple of years ago because grew up when Jurassic Park came out, and then I think my parents were just trying to find anything else that was dinosaur related, and so that was on like BBC Two, like on a Sunday afternoon they'd show the Doug McClure films, and they're fantastical bits of British filmmaking from the 70s.
I know, and the special effects are, on the one hand, it's a bit like early Doctor Who. The one hand, they're kind of cheap and a bit shonky, but weirdly effective. Yeah. And they hold up in a way that more quote-unquote sophisticated special effects from the 80s and 90s now look really, really dated, whereas it is kind of models and puppets and pterodactyls flying through the sky, menacing you. But it does work really well, I think. Yeah.
And I for Edgar Rice Burroughs, reading him, it's interesting that he seems to be taking it pretty much all from Arthur Conan Doyle, but he loses that, I don't know, the sense of fun. It's sort of it's still an adventure, still a romp, but essentially every time they come across anything, they just shoot it. And the kind of, at least with Verne and with Doyle, they're still trying to think of the science, even if it's just as a way into the story. I think with Burroughs, he's made the science in his head, and he will just write about it or take what other fiction authors have written and use that as the basis rather than, I don't know, periodicals or journals of the time.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I mean, one of the things that distinguishes Verne is that he's very scrupulous about including as much actual science and descriptions of the natural world as he can, because his books were aimed to be educative as well as entertaining, and that was partly why they sold as widely as they did. That people would buy them for their kids, and the kids were supposed to be 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea is an exciting adventure about an advanced submarine, but it's also full of all the, by the 1860s standards, up-to-date knowledge of marine life and ecosystems, and that was something that. And it's also true of Wells to a large extent. Sometimes Wells it's just fantastically extrapolative, but often he grounds what he wants to write in his understanding of science and the possibilities. I think with pulps, a lot of that goes out the window. The aim is to be thrilling and exciting. And dinosaurs, amongst other things, become, as with kind of aliens or robots, become a trope. They become something of a caricature, and you kind of know what they're getting. And it is to do with the monstrosity of them and the scale of them and the threat of them. That leaves science behind.
I was looking at the bridging the gap between Edgar Rice Burroughs, that's kind of beginning of the First World War, end of the First World War sort of era. And then the next person on my list is Ray Bradbury. And that story is then in the 1950s. So it's that gap. I'm trying to find the authors within that space, but I think they seem to be looking at obviously the anxieties of the time, and that was the nuclear war and Cold War that came out of it. And so I think eyes went elsewhere, and things like Dinosaurs, things like they were too passé, maybe too done, and so the new terror was nuclear fallout. And this is sort of what the main idea of this whole series is that dinosaurs in fiction and in science fiction are there as our anxiety for our place our place within time, our place on the planet. Science fiction, does it have to always be about that sort of anxiety of us as humans on the planet and what we do.
It often is, isn't it? But I think it also has a utopian strain that sometimes comes through where you feel, to mention Wells, although he didn't write about dinosaurs, which is, thinking about it, given how much he wrote, widely he wrote, it's kind of interesting. But Wells divides between, sometimes he writes anxious dystopian books about how everything can go wrong, but often he writes kind of forward-looking utopian books about how we're going to create a perfectly equitable world state and then colonize the stars and everything's going to be great. I mean, the anxiety thing is, just from a practical point of view, if I speak as the writer, the problem with utopia is it's not very dramatic. There's no conflict. And so then if there's no conflict, there's no drama. There's no drama, there's no story. If everything is happy, everyone's happy and everything's fine, then there's no real story there. Whereas dealing with those sorts of anxieties, I think, is key. And I think so in that post-war period, one of the things that's going along, I don't mean to continually muddy the waters here by conflating science fiction and fantasy, but there are an interesting set of dragons in the 1930s and 40s and in the early 50s. And Tolkien, in The Hobbit in 1937, had Smaug, this giant dragon. And he's not a dinosaur, but he is a big threat and kind of anxiety-producing. And there are dragons in Tolkien's mythography, and then fantasy as a mode is getting going, and dragons quite often appear there. But I think that is more conservative with a small c, that is more kind of historically oriented and backward looking. Whereas this is where we started, isn't it? Dinosaurs are even more historical in one sense, but in another sense they're kind of up to date. So the novum, the thing that makes Ray Bradbury's story science fiction, is time travel, and the idea that you would commercialize that and you would send people back as tourists to explore the park, but they have to keep on this. I mean, it doesn't actually make a lot of sense if you try and think it through, but it's dramatically it works very well that you can disturb the past by building this path that they have to walk on and sending people to be back there. But if you you can disturb the past by having people shoot dinosaurs as big game hunters, but if you step off the path, if you pet on a butterfly, it will completely change what the future's going to be. I wonder how it works that way.
Yeah. Do you think he was trying to say something about game hunting at that for that?
I do wonder about that, don't I? Because we're talking that is a kind of Edgar Rice Burroughs or of its era thing. I know people still do go big game hunting, but it's not acceptable anymore. There was something in the news a couple of days ago about how a big game hunter was trampled to death by an elephant, and the social media were full of serves him right for going to shoot these beasts. And I don't think that was the case. You read Ernest Hemingway, and he's revels in going out into Africa and shooting game. And I suppose you can imagine that if you're going to shoot big game, that it's not going to come any bigger than Brontosaurus. That dinosaurs are at one end of that.
Yeah, it's fascinating. So we're in the sort of golden age of science fiction with Ray Bradbury. So 1940 to 1960, is that sort of the time where the literary...
These kind of categories are slightly artificial. It's a whole flux, a continuity of lots of different kinds of text being produced. But I think that's certainly the narrative that critics and historians of science fiction talk about, that the pulp era is from the 19-teens through to the 1940s. And from the 40s through to about the early 60s, you get the golden age. And it's a very loaded term, isn't it? Still very famous writers, Isaac Asimov and Ray Bradbury. I think Ray Bradbury maybe is a bit more of a new wave writer. But Robert Heinlein, Arthur C. Clarke, people doing kind of classic science fiction, what people often think of as science fiction. And the thing that I love about science fiction, the thing that draws me to it as a writer and a critic, is that you can do anything at all. You're really not constrained by the lineaments of actual reality, particularly in life. You can go anywhere in the universe, you can tell any kind of story, you can have any kind of adventure.
And I suppose the outlier on my list is Anne McCaffrey, who you sort of think of as is she a fantasy author with dragons?
Yeah, she was always very adamant that she was a science fiction author. She got a bit cross when people categorized her as a fantasy author. I mean, the people call her a fantasy author because her most successful series was The Dragon Riders of Pern, which is clearly about dragons. And there are dozens of dragon novels that she wrote, and they were hugely successful. And they're still very readable. She would say, no, this isn't fantasy. This isn't going back to a kind of medieval world, which happens to include magic and dragons. It's set on this alien planet called Pern. The dragons of Pern are alien beasts that happen to resemble dragons, and they are able to breathe fire because, and she spells out the kind of chemical reasons that it's happened. And we discover as it goes on that they've been, what we say, genetically modified, we would say now, but that's not the phrase she uses, to have these attributes, because the particular situation in this world of Pern is that these threads periodically come and kill all life, and the dragons can fly around and burn up the threads with their fiery breath. So it's all rationalized. And she was very, again, it goes back to what you're saying, she was kind of careful to get the science and the chemistry right, and she consulted scientists and chemists to that end. That said, I haven't read all the dragon novels of Anne McCaffrey. I've read quite a few of them, and they do read like fantasy. They are basically romance fantasy texts with those sorts of adventures and those sorts of things going on. And you've got these wonderful dragons flying around in the sky. I mean, it's the same with A Dinosaur Planet. Now, that's not my favourite Anne McCaffrey novel, I must say. She was born in America. She's raised in America. Her mother was of Irish extraction, and in, I think, 1970, she divorced her husband and moved to Ireland and became a naturalised citizen of Ireland and lived the rest of her life in Ireland, a long life. But she was in some kind of financial straits, so she wrote a lot, and she pitched lots of ideas to lots of publishers. She pitched the idea of a dinosaur novel to Futura, the London-based publisher, and they said, yes, we'd like a dinosaur novel. Make it so that kids will enjoy it, because that we think is going to be the market for this sort of a story. So it is what we would now call YA, I suppose. And I don't want to spoil it for you, Robin, but it's set on a distant planet, a planet called Ireta, where some explorers get marooned. They get stuck there. It's slightly odd that presumably it's set in some point in Earth's future, because we now have spaceships and we're exploring different planets and so on. The characters in the novel wander around and they see these alien creatures, but they don't recognize that they're dinosaurs, although they are dinosaurs. And you know that because the name of the novel is Dinosaur Planet. So they call them, there are pterodactyls, and they call them gifts. They christen them this name. And then there are Tyrannosaurus Rex, Tyrannosauri Rex, I should say, for the plural, and they call them fang faces. And then about 2/3 of the way through the novel, it's like, oh, actually, these are dinosaurs from Earth. And it seems actually that they wouldn't recognize them. I mean, then there's a kind of explanation as to how it is that dinosaurs from Earth have been seeded on this alien planet. And that becomes part of the mystery of what's going on. And once it gets going, it's perfectly fine. Slightly simplistic adventure story that's aimed at kids, and it's from quite early on in McCaffrey as her. I'm not sure she's firing on all her cylinders as a writer. But then as through the 70s, she writes lots of other stuff, and she starts to become famous. And she becomes famous particularly for the dragon books, which I think are doing similar things, going to an alien planet and finding these iconic creatures, but telling more exciting stories. Yeah, there was a whole series of Dragon Planet novels, so they weren't a flop, and they obviously reached an audience, but I don't think anyone would put them in the front.
No, top tier McCaffrey.
Top tier McCaffrey or top tier dinosaur stories, I don't know.
Yeah. Well, I'm interested to see. And then in the 80s, late 80s, 89, we get Jurassic Park, which is the book, the reason why this podcast exists.
Yeah.
When did you first read it, and what did you make of it?
So I read it when it came out, and I read all of Michael Crichton, and he's become a slightly more controversial figure because towards the end of his life he became a climate change denier, didn't he? And he espoused various views. But the two really significant things that he created, I mean, one of the things, the reason I read him was because I thought I've forgotten the name of it, the theme park with the robots.
Westworld.
Westworld. How can I forget that name? I remember seeing Westworld, like you say, on BBC Two late at night Yul Brynner playing the sinister robot gunslinger. I thought that was amazing. And I watched the Andromeda Strain, which is a really effective science fiction thriller. But these are both kind of scripted. The ideas were Michael Crichton. But two just fantastically influential things he did. One was because his early career was as what you would say, a casualty, an emergency room doctor. He conceived ER. And ER became this enormous kind of phenomenon on the telly. And it's now The Pit is basically the ER reborn. And that's one of the inheritances, which is the kind of realistic side of Mike Crichton's experience. But he also was just very adept at taking these ideas. He's not the first person to write a dinosaur story, is he? But he just writes it really effectively. So in terms of how much paleontological accuracy there is, at the heart of the novel, there is this kind of hand wave. And he's obviously done enough research to know that you can't simply pull strands of perfect DNA out of blood that's inside a mosquito, that's inside a piece of amber that's been there for literally millions of years. It's not stepped out of time. So he has this, then there's this system that we have that somehow resurrects this DNA, and then we inject it into whatever they injected into, I don't know, cows, horses, chickens, to create these dinosaurs. But that doesn't matter because he's hurrying us past that to get to the adventure itself. And that's just really nicely paced. And then when the movie came out, and the movie came out quite soon after, I think. So if the novel's 1990, the movie's 1993. I think that is one of the cases where, although a lot of 1990s movies, the special effects have not aged well, I think they still hold up in Jurassic Park the movie. And you do get that sense of wonder and the sense of scale. And you do get the way that it's not just about showing big dinosaurs on the screen rampaging around. It's about hinting at them. It's about the sense of them coming and the size and the scale and the danger of them. And it's about the ripples and the little glass of water on the shelf of the car that let you know that you can intuit this is something of a very large scale that's coming. Yeah. So do you prefer the book or do you prefer the movie?
I think you can have them both and enjoy them both in different ways. I quite like how they feel so different, and yet when they come together, and they did quite a few times, Spielberg adds the heart, which Crichton doesn't always have. His characters are a little bit one-dimensional. They're functional. They're doing, rather than Spielberg's who emote.
No, I think that's astute. I think that's exactly right, actually. But then the other thing to say about the Jurassic Park is that there's hundreds of sequels, and a lot of them are no good. Sometimes there are sequences from some of them that you think, okay, but so I don't know why it's not possible to catch that lightning in a bottle again, although they keep trying. And I think they're trying not just because Jurassic Park was a big box office success, but because there's something about that ought to work. There ought to be another exciting adventure you can tell where human beings and these dinosaurs interact.
Yeah, and I think they've tried to, through the Jurassic World films, they've tried to make it bigger maybe and expand upon Crichton's ideas about genetic modification even more, creating mutations. And that it feels quite Crichton in that way that maybe if there was a third book, that is sort of maybe what he would have gone down to. But then in the latest film, Rebirth, they've shrunk it because it feels like we're then going back to the era of Arthur Conan Doyle and nostalgic idea that in the mists, or there is this island like King Kong where these things still exist.
Yeah, I mean, King Kong is really interesting, isn't it? Because if we go back to the kind of hole in the narrative of 20th century dinosaur storytelling, King Kong is a 1930s kind of text, a work that is doing something similar. It's doing something similar, but not with a dinosaur. It's doing it with a gigantic ape, but it's giving us the same sense of scale. And the island that King Kong is on is populated by these creatures that should have died out, but they're preserved like Conan Doyle's Lost World. But the heart of King Kong is you don't just go to the island and have an adventure. You bring Kong back, and then you get him rampaging around New York. As in the original film and in Peter Jackson's remake, which is much longer. I mean, that's partly, I think, one of the things that goes wrong with the the sequels to Jurassic Park is that the assumption is, well, obviously we've got to get these dinosaurs off this island and have them stampeding around small town America. That's where the excitement is. And I'm not sure it is, actually. I'm not sure, because I think the point about Kong is we do sympathise. We empathise with Kong, wrenched out of his world, and he's in this strange place, and everyone's trying to scare him with flashbulbs and shoot him with biplanes. And all he wants to do is just to hang out with Fay Ray, and there's a great pathos in that story. I don't think pathos is the idiom of Jurassic Park. I don't think that's. I mean, you're quite right about Crichton and his characterization. There is something a bit kind of calculating and cold about his imagination. Whereas I think you're right. Spielberg has immense heart, and he manages to put that through. But I don't think we ever empathise with the Tyrannosaurus Rex in that movie, or do we? And maybe in some of the later movies, there's that.
The later films, they try. It's the same thing with any sort of villain. Yeah, that it's if you have a villain around long enough, it becomes the hero of the films. Like, I don't know, like Terminator. It always whatever you were afraid of in 10 years' time, 5 films on, it'll be the hero of the film. That seems to be the trajectory of villains.
And it's another example of a series that's diminishing returns, the Terminator film, much as I love them. I mean, it's partly just that Hollywood thing that you can't leave well alone. You can't just say, well, make the perfect movie, let's leave it there, because there's so much money that you might make. So you don't just make The Matrix, you have to make repeated sequels of The Matrix where it all goes a bit wrong.
Yeah. When Jurassic Park came out, and then it almost sort of stops the dinosaur story again after like years of science fiction stories, and then you have Jurassic Park, and you feel like that should create a new wave.
Yeah,
there's a few. So I've managed to find Greg Bear. He did it's sort of a YA story of a continuation of Arthur Conan Doyle's Lost World, Dinosaur Summer. But the next one I found was contains dinosaurs is Stephen Baxter's Evolution,
right,
which spans 4 billion years.
Yeah, it's typically small scale Steve. I mean, I know Steve and I love him, but he does go for that. So it starts 65 million years ago, and it goes hundreds of million years into our future. But it's also just a series of. I mean, it's a really interesting novel. It's a kind of fix-up, so that each of the chapters is a separate little short story set at a different period in history, starting with creatures. And a lot of the characters aren't really sapient. They're not sentient. They're just animals, or pre-hominids or whatever they might be, living their lives as best they can. And I do find it's quite a depressing book in a way. It just seems to be saying over and over again, life is the same thing, that you struggle and you try and get food and you have sex and have babies, and then you get eaten by a dinosaur, or you die. And then just when civilization starts to pull itself together, there's some enormous planetary catastrophe that wipes everybody out. And also that, I mean, in that sense, one thing, I mean, I know Stephen, he's a great guy, he's a great writer, but he is a trained scientist, and he takes that very seriously. So one of the things that Evolution does as a novel is it repudiates the idea that evolution is, to use the jargon, teleological. So that is a way of saying that in the 19th century especially, there was a belief that evolution was kind of like a ladder, that you start with primitive forms of life and they become more and more sophisticated. They arrive at us, and we're kind of the pinnacle of life. And actually, Darwin is very particular. That's not how evolution works. Evolution is kind of chance. And it's simply mutations that fit the environment are passed on. It has happened for us, you and I, that intelligence has enabled us to thrive as a species, but there's no reason to think that's going to continue to be the truth. And in evolution, Steve is very kind of ruthless in saying, well, no, in this far advanced, a million years in the future, intelligence would be a handicap rather than an advantage, so that it's not that the creatures in the novel evolve. It's not like Wells's time traveller going into the future and finding Eloy and Morlocks. It's just that that's how evolution works, that the environment changes, so the thing that fits you best, the environment changes. And the later chapters in that novel are weird, tiny creatures that can barely think, that are still just trying to survive and pass on their. But the scope of it is amazing, and he's done that in multiple novels, Steve Baxter. He's just he's unafraid to take on the longest possible timescale.
Yeah. Is that hard sci-fi? Because I've sort of been reading around the different genres. I'm not very well versed in science fiction as a whole, so it's been interesting reading your book. Very illuminating. And yeah, I keep coming across hard sci-fi, and I was thinking of this book and I thought, does that fit into that sort of mold?
Yeah, and most of what Steve Baxter has written is hard science fiction. And by hard science fiction, really all we mean is that it obeys the laws of science as we understand them. So lots of the familiar fixtures of science fiction have no basis in science and are as impossible as a magic wand, particularly faster than light travel. So there are lots of, again, hand waves in various science fiction texts that say, well, you get aboard the USS Enterprise and it engages its warp drive and it travels faster than light to go across the galaxy. There's no such thing. You can't travel faster than light. You can travel to distant stars, but it will take you hundreds or thousands of years, and then you have to accommodate that. And Steve is very good at doing that because he does know his science. I mean, again, I speak as a science fiction writer, but my background is in the arts and humanities. So I take a more flexible view of science. I'm interested in what the story can, what the science can enable interesting stories. And I don't think that Steve Baxter is a fundamentalist about that. Some of his stories are able to explore, pull and squeeze the possibilities of absolute science. But he does respect the science, and a lot of fans like that, and they like their science fiction to be hard science fiction. But yes, I mean, so this is not a story about magically bringing dinosaurs back to life so that they can phase around Los Angeles. This is a story that says 65 million years ago, you've got Australopithecus, or kind of pre-hominid creatures that coexisted with dinosaurs, and some of them got eaten by dinosaurs because that's the way these things are.
Yeah, it's fascinating. That sort of like the new millennium idea of science and science fiction, because we're sort of towards the end of the list. I'm looking at self-publishing. A lot of science fiction authors are finding an audience through self-publishing rather than following traditional publishing. Out of all the genres, why do you think science fiction can still have that audience even though it hasn't got a traditional publisher behind it?
That's a really good question, and I'm trying to think that there was an answer that might have obtained a while back, which is that science fiction fans are more likely to be tech savvy. They're more likely to be early adopters of all this technology. They're more likely to be, habituated to reading on a screen, let's say. But no longer true. Everyone, my kids have grown up. They're tech natives. This is second nature to them. And I honestly don't know, and I confess my ignorance, how much crime or romance gets self-pub. Yeah. I mean, I think it is the case that I teach creative writing. One of the things I do at Royal Holloway, we have to go through this with the creative writing students. This is how you might get a conventional, traditional publishing contract. This is how you can self-pub. The difficulty with self-publication is there's so much of it. It's a Niagara of content, and you have to find a way of getting your story and your book into people's phones, into their eyes. And that's hard to do because you're just on your own. You haven't got a publicity campaign that's being paid for by a publisher. You haven't got a PR officer who's getting you reviewed and so on. That said, the advantage self-pub has is that it's cheaper, so that even if you're just buying an ebook from a regular publisher, it costs that publisher almost as much to produce an ebook as it does to produce a physical book, because most of the cost of a book is the industry professionals who work on it and the editors and the cover artists and the copy editors, and a small fraction is the actual paper and glue and so on. And that means that if you're just doing all that yourself, you can sell it much more cheaply. So I think there is some, I don't want to speculate, but my understanding is some of the genres, the subgenres of science fiction do particularly well with self-pubs. And military science fiction, there are fans who just love stories about space marines fighting aliens. And you can buy lots and lots of military science fiction that's been self-pub, and it costs you £1, and you read it on your commute, and that's great, and everyone's happy. What interests me is those cases where, so the classic example is Andy Weir, who tried to get The Martian published and nobody was interested, so he published it himself on his own website. And then it just really took off and became this enormous global bestseller. Once it was a global bestseller, traditional publishers were then very interested in him and money and put it out as a regular book, and it was made into a big movie with Ridley Scott. I think it would have been improved. We can agree if there'd been some dinosaurs on Mars. I think that would have
of course,
a tweak, always. But it was just a huge thing. And now he's one of the most famous science fiction writers on the planet at the minute, and that's where he started. So that's the kind of dream. I'm still not sure, and I kind of looked into it a bit, but I'm still not sure what it was about that story and his circumstance. Maybe it is just spin of the roulette wheel, and it just so happens. It's a well-paced story, and it's a story that, if you're interested in how to survive in an alien environment, if you're in what the terrain of Mars is like, if you're interested in the practicalities of interplanetary travel, it's got lots of interesting details about that. And that takes us back to Jules Verne, who put lots of contemporary science into his books in order so that they're educative as well as being entertaining. And it does tell an interesting story. I mean, again, it's not a complicated story because it hangs on one question, which is, do you think he's going to survive or not? Is he going to die on Mars, or is he going to get home again and be rescued? That's the thing that keeps you reading until... Have you read The Martian, by the way? Have you seen the movie?
No, I haven't. No, I've seen the film, yeah.
Okay, well, it's the same story in the film, really.
Yeah.
Why that became such a big self-pub phenomenon, I don't know. I mean, there are other aspects of it. There are forms of text that it's harder to find a conventional publisher for. Erotica, for instance, and some the specific kinks that some people are interested in. Then you self-pub that because then you reach your particular audience. And if you are a digital native and you can navigate the web, you can find enough people to buy your book to make it a viable thing. So I suppose what we're saying is, do we think that there's a dinosaur fan base out there waiting for...
I think there might be. I feel like with the resurgence of, the films are still very popular. I just wonder whether the films have given us the image of dinosaurs that we're comfortable with. And Jurassic Park is still the epitome of dinosaur entertainment. Even 30 years on, nothing has come along really to challenge that. So, yeah, I don't know. Maybe there's somebody waiting with an amazing story about dinosaurs that is about to be unleashed into the future.
Yeah, here's hope.
That's it, yeah. Well, I'd just like to say thank you so much for joining me today. I was wondering whether you're working on anything at the moment or have got something coming out.
I do. I have a novel coming out in October, but I'm sorry to say it has no dinosaurs in it at all. And now I feel like I've let the world down. I wrote a book. It's called Frankenstein Rex, which sounds like it should be a dinosaur, but it's not. It's a sort of sequel to Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. And I took the idea that if you read the original Frankenstein, the monster is extraordinarily clever and effectively invulnerable. So I assumed, well, let's say he's immortal and can't be killed, and he's incredibly strong and much larger than a regular human being, but also very, very intelligent. Over the 200 years from then till now, my Frankenstein's monster becomes king of the world. That's what the Rex means. So it's set kind of nowish, but in an alternate version of the world where we're now living in a single world state, and it's governed by King Frankenstein, who is in some respects a benign tyrant, but in other respects is a monster, because that's what he is. So it's about an attempt to assassinate the king of the world, who happens to be Frankenstein's monster. It's not entirely unadjacent to dinosaurs and what dinosaurs get up to, but I'll have to think of a dinosaur story.
Please do. Fantastic. So I was wondering where people can find you online, if indeed you want them to.
Yeah, I have a Substack. I'm on Blue Sky. I'm Adam Roberts on Blue Sky, and you can find me there. And it has links to my Substack where I publish articles and essays about all sorts. Or you can find me at Royal Holloway, the University of London, on the university website if you want to drop me a line.
Fantastic. Well, again, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you for inviting me, Roland. It's been great. I've enjoyed talking about it. It's good.
Thank you so much to Adam for that conversation. And I think there was some great information in that conversation just about how how stories are constructed as well. And I hope you take that with you on this journey that I'm going on, looking at the dinosaur stories in fiction. You can follow Adam Roberts on Blue Sky and his Substack. Please look in the show notes for the links. There's also links to his books, The History of Science Fiction, it's an incredible tome, and it is just exactly everything that you will ever need to know about the genre of science fiction. There's also pre-order links for Frankenstein Rex, and he's also got a book coming out which is an A to Z of J.R.R. Tolkien. In 2 weeks' time, that's the 15th of July, I'll be bringing you my first book review episode, which is Jules Verne's Journey to the Centre of the Earth.
I often say this on the show, like one of the things I look out for in Lost World media is the sort of opening Lost World scene where the characters first realise they're not in Kansas anymore. And ever since Jules Verne's Journey to the Centre of the Earth, I think having the camera pull back and show a forest of giant fungi.
Yes,
So many writers have used that one over the years. It's tantamount to having the camera pull back and see that there's, two moons in the sky.
So joining me on that episode is the amazing Cian Gill from the Lost Valley podcast. We had so much fun talking about it. If you want to know more about the show, then head over to Instagram at Jurassic Pirates Pod. I'll be uploading little clips from the interview and much, much more. But until then, I'll just say thank you very, very much for listening, and goodbye.